The brain has to communicate with the rest of the body. The most input and output travels by way of the spinal cord. However, in addition, there are 12 pairs of cranial nerves that arise from the base of the brain and exit the cranium through the foramina, or the holes that we learned about in the skeletal system. They lead to muscles and sense organs that are located mainly in the head and neck. Most motor fibers of the cranial nerves begin in nuclei of the brainstem and lead to glands and muscles. We reviewed some of these in the earlier sections of this chapter. However, we didn't name any of them. The sensory fibers begin in receptors that are located mainly in the head and neck and lead mainly to the brainstem. Sensory fibers for proprioception may travel to the brain in a different nerve from the motor nerve. Most cranial nerves carry fibers between the brainstem and the ipsilateral receptors and effectors. Lesion in the left brainstem causes sensory or motor deficit on the same side. The exceptions are in the optic nerve, where half of the fibers decussate and half of them stay on the ipsilateral side, and the trochlear nerve, where all the efferent fibers lead to a muscle of the contralateral eye. In cranial nerve classification, we can consider motor, sensory, and mixed nerves. This is a breakdown of which ones are which. I wouldn't say you need to memorize that per se. The sensory functions can be quite unrelated to the motor functions. For example, facial nerve 6 has a sensory role in taste and a motor role in facial expression. Here are each of the cranial nerves. This week in your diagramming assignment, you'll be expected to name and label each of these, and then you'll be required to learn them on the human brain as well as the sheep's brain. You'll notice that they're named in sequence from front to back, with the olfactory nerve being 1 and the optic nerve being 2. Let's begin by looking at number 1, the olfactory nerve. It's involved in the sense of smell. Damage to it causes an impaired sense of smell. The olfactory bulb is attached to these fascicles of the olfactory nerve that dip down into the nasal mucosa. Remember, they come through the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone. The signals are then conducted along the olfactory tract, which is the actual nerve that we're interested in. The optic nerve provides us with vision. It's a very large nerve and easy to find. It decussates right under the pituitary gland. Damage to it can cause blindness in part or all of the visual field. Some of the fibers will decussate, cross over, and some of the fibers will remain on the same side as this optic nerve projects information back onto the visual cortex. Number 3 is the oculomotor nerve. It controls muscles that turn the eyeball up and down and medial, as well as controlling the iris, lens, and upper eyelid. Oculo, eye, motor, movement, so that makes sense. Damage could cause a drooping eyelid, dilated pupils, double vision, or difficulty focusing and inability to move the eye in certain directions. The trochlear nerve is involved in eye movement also. It's involved in the superior oblique muscle. 5 is the trigeminal nerve. It's the largest of the cranial nerve. It's the most important sensory nerve in the face. It forks into 3 different divisions: the ophthalmic division, the maxillary division, and the mandibular division. You don't need to memorize what's sensory and what's mixed. Just notice that there's a division between the two. Number 6 is the abducens nerve. This provides eye movement of the lateral rectus. The 7th nerve is the facial nerve. It has both motor and sensory function. The motor nerve innervates facial muscles and is involved in facial expressions, salivary gland action, tear, nasal, and palatine gland action. It's involved in the anterior 2/3 of the tongue and taste. Damage can produce sagging facial muscles and disturbed sense of taste, no sweet or salty. There are 5 branches of the facial nerve. You don't need to know each of these branches, but just be familiar there are 5 of them. 8 is the vestibulocochlear nerve. Again, it describes the function precisely. Vestibulo and cochlear. The vestibular system is about balance in the inner ear, and the cochlear is about hearing in the inner ear. So this nerve is involved in hearing and equilibrium. So damage to it could cause deafness, dizziness, nausea, loss of balance, or involuntary oscillations in the eyes called nystagmus. 9 is the glossopharyngeal nerve. Glosso being the tongue, pharyngeal being around the pharynx. So it's involved in swallowing, salivation, gag reflex, and control of blood pressure and respiration. It also takes sensations from the posterior 1/3 of the tongue. Damage results in loss of bitter and sour taste and impaired swallowing. 10 is the vagus nerve. Now, it innervates a lot, hence the name. Oh, no, that's not really it. It has a major role in the control of cardiac, pulmonary, digestive, and urinary function. We'll see a lot about the vagus nerve next semester. Damage to it can cause hoarseness, loss of voice, impaired swallowing, and it could be fatal if it's cut because look at all the organs that it innervates. 11 is the accessory nerves. The accessory nerves are involved in swallowing, head, neck, and shoulder movement. Thus, damage can cause impaired head, neck, and shoulder movement. 12 is the hypoglossal nerve. Hypo under glossal tongue. Tongue movements and speech, food manipulation, and swallowing are the things that are affected by the hypoglossal nerve. So, that may seem like a whole lot of information. Your main focus should be locating each of these nerves in Anatomy and Physiology Revealed and looking at where they originate and the base of the brain. Now, there's several aids to memorizing the order of these nerves. Here's one of them. Old Opie occasionally tries trigonometry and feels very gloomy, vague, and hypoactive. That is olfactory, optic, oculomotor, trochlear, trigeminal, abducens, facial, vestibulocochlear, glossopharyngeal, vagus, accessory, and hypoglossal. In your text, you'll find a number of tables that summarize the functions of each nerve. You should be familiar with each of the functions. So why don't you form yourself an outline right now of each of the cranial nerves and what their function is?